God, this video terrifies me. Before you jump to a conclusion, please hear me out. October 6th, 2019, the slideshow commentary community was hit with a document posted by user Channel Gray, written by an ex-user Leo or whatever, detailing their experience talking with ex-commentator George Raccoon. This experience, explaining how they felt groomed by George, was the first time in recent memory that the SCC ever dealt with an expose in a typical cancel culture way. In retort, instead of defending himself, George left the internet, presumably admitting to his guilt, depending on who you ask. To most people in this community, that was the end of it. George fucked off, the groomer was gone, and Leo was deemed a hero. However, I wasn't happy, because I didn't believe George groomed Leo. I initially tried voicing this belief on a live stream when tensions were high, and botched it all up. I put way too much of an onus on Leo, who had believed they were groomed, which to everyone else looked like I was blatantly victim blaming, which was understandable. I took the massive L and apologized for it, and then stayed silent about it publicly until fairly recently, when I started getting tired of hearing how someone who I didn't believe was a groomer was falsely labeled as such. So now, I finally want to talk about it when everyone else has moved on. So, content warning, I guess. It's right there in black and white. This video will heavily talk about grooming. I also want to warn for mentions of rape, manipulation, gaslighting, abuse. I think that's it. Right, pedophilia too. Okay, now I think we're good. So, to begin this structural disaster of a video, I guess let's break down what the accusations themselves are. Mind you, the way that I'm wording these is just what the accusations are. Obviously, I'll be spending the rest of the duration of this video detailing which ones are accurate, and which ones definitely needed more evidence. But with that said, the accusations are that George, who was in his 20s, led an at-the-time minor on his NSFW-ish account. He would draw his friends, including said minor, in Snow White dresses, which were a fetish of his, send pictures of himself wearing said dress to the minor, this was seen as him being sexual, would constantly pester the minor, who, should also mention at this point, was trans, into wearing said dress, which was uncomfortable for them, came back to doing all this stuff after being confronted about it initially, sent videos of magic tricks to a minor, magic tricks being another fetish of his. After Leo broke off the friendship with George, he had blown up in their DMs with a lot of concerning self-destructive messages, and blatantly admitted to grooming Leo. Wow, these accusations seem rather damning, right? It's cut and dry. That should be the end of it. Video over. George groomed Leo. Roll credits. Except this is when I scream in frustration at how quickly people were to believe these accusations, especially in 2019, a year after the Spockter Theory situation happened. So let's go over what is and isn't true within this document, starting with something that is objectively true, because I do want to go into this as unbiased as humanly possible. I won't be able to go into it fully unbiased, of course, but, you know, I'll give it a fair chance. George did let Leo onto his NSFW-ish account. So, to elaborate, as someone who also followed that account at the time, George had a specific account where he could share more adult themes to his friends who were more comfortable with it. There wasn't anything necessarily explicit ever posted on there, I want to assure you, and this was detailed out the gate for anyone who followed that account, as the pinned tweet had this image directly connect to it. You may be noticing some other things on here that'll be important later, and don't worry, we'll come back to them. The important part of this image at the moment, though, is rule number 1. Porn and nudity will not be retweeted on here. So nothing that George shared directly was NSFW. So in that sense, he was fine. However, considering that he did label it as NSFW-ish, that's still arguably not exactly okay, and as someone who's kept in touch with him for all this time, yes, even he acknowledges in hindsight this was not okay. So sure, in that sense, George was irresponsible. Not to the extent he should be ostracized and crucified for it, personally, I'd argue, but definitely should have been informed that this was not okay. So with that out of the way, I would also like to confirm something else explained in Leo's document, being that George did have a habit of self-destructing at the time, and I think just about everyone who was friends with him at the time had told him that this was a problem at some point. So him going into Leo's DMs in the screenshots we do see towards the end of the document are kinda on brand. This is also something I'd argue shouldn't be a huge strike against George, though, as we don't see him doing it maliciously in the screenshots we get. In fact, everything that George says in those screenshots are evidence more against the idea that he was doing it to be purposely manipulative, as his messages say that he fucked up, and that Leo shouldn't feel bad or concerned about anything he was saying, trying to reassure Leo that they can move on. But did George have any reason to feel as such? Well, this is why this video exists, because I plan to make the argument that no, no, I don't think he should. Now, mind you, I'm not an expert. I should get that out of the gate. I'm merely giving my thoughts and feelings on this 2-year-old situation and why I disagreed with the common consensus. Whether or not you think I'm right or wrong by the end of it is entirely up to you. If your mind's made up, it's made up. I won't fight you on it. And as such, I want to stress to not go out and harass the individuals involved in this situation, especially given what I have to say about the situation by the end of it all. 1, because, yeah, this drama is about 2 years old and most everyone has moved on. 2, nobody, no matter how heinous their actions are, deserves harassment, contrary to the popular belief. And 3, because harassing people is lame. Plain and simple. So now that I have the formalities out of the way, let's begin with the first part of the grooming allegation, the Snow White dress. So, something to note about George is that his favorite Disney princess is Snow White, and apparently in accordance to Leo, he and George would bond over their mutual appreciation for the character. Leo would allow George to draw their character wearing the dress of the titular character, and didn't see anything wrong with it until Gwen, another character in this story, informed Leo that the dress was a kink of George's, and that George was forbidden to draw anything regarding Leo and her dress. But, hold on. George's aforementioned rules bulletin explicitly mentions that he doesn't see Snow White as a kink of his. This was established on his NSFW-ish account from the beginning. So for Leo to sit there and believe something that was blatantly against that established descriptor feels kind of sketchy to me. Especially when Leo follows up explaining this to the reader that if you ask George about Snow White being a kink of his, he'd deny it, which always struck me as strange. To sit here and preemptively revoke any further discussion on this kind of topic by making such a blanket and certain statement claiming the subject to be a liar when the information they give doesn't match your own feels, ironically enough, like a lie in of itself. The tone of this document is to inform or educate people on your own experiences with an individual you claim to have groomed you. But as much as it typically isn't what people want to hear, there usually is 2 sides to a story such as this. And without the proper evidence to prove that your opposition has a behavioral pattern with lying or manipulation, this kind of claim feels more like its sole purpose is to shine a much more malicious light on your target instead of giving out the truth. Or at the very least, a believable testimony, which isn't something you would want to do if your goal is to educate people on a groomer in the community. But to me, it doesn't have to be a straight-up sexual thing, because it is clearly something he finds appealing. I'd also like to directly respond to this, because I find it to be frustrating. This claim would only be valid if we were to be under the prenotion that George's appreciation for Snow White was sexual in nature, which, as I demonstrated, I don't have any reason to believe is the case, and with that, George could find this dress to be an aesthetic appeal, or maybe an appeal to nostalgia, or literally any other appeal that you could look at that's used in art and advertising. Appeal doesn't have to be sexual. This is again unfortunate to this document because anyone who thinks about this for longer than a minute tops could come to the same conclusion. I like to draw hoodies on my characters that don't typically have them and call them cool jackets because they're fun and there's an appeal in drawing that. That doesn't mean hoodies turn me on. Get real. Anyway, then Leo explains that Gwen chewed George out about it. George backed down from drawing Leo in a Snow White dress, probably intimidated by Gwen if I'm to be honest, though of course, that would be something you'd have to ask the supposed groomer in this scenario. And then cut to 2 years later in 2019. George winds up drawing Leo in a Snow White dress twice. Leo goes on to make the theory that it's because by this point they didn't hang out with Gwen anymore, and George, quote-unquote, knew he wouldn't be called out about it. And I'm so glad Leo clarified it as such, because otherwise it would heavily look like a narrative was being spun to ruin someone, and we definitely wouldn't want that. But in reality, could we not make the argument that George just forgot about what happened 2 years prior? Leo doesn't clarify that there was any conversation regarding the two of them that would have reminded George of the conversation in question, so this is again, at best, just an assumption on Leo's end that paints George in a much different light than what might have been the actual truth of the matter. Plus, Leo even tells us following this that George asked to draw the first piece for them, so even if he did remember, maybe he wanted to see if the opinion on the matter changed from whatever Gwen might have talked to George about, since we also didn't get that side of the story, and was instead just told to get it through Gwen's at the time Twitter handle. Following this, there's an explanation of George's self-destructive behavior, before going on to justify that as the reason Leo said yes to everything that George did. And it's here that I really start questioning matters, because throughout the entire document, there's not a whole lot of screenshots to help Leo's case, and Leo does explain that because George deleted everything, they didn't exactly have the time or ability to screen cap everything that they thought was important. And like, okay, I get that. But when the screenshots that you do share are just you happily nodding to everything and getting excited that George drew you in a Snow White dress while simultaneously telling us, the reader, that you were uncomfortable about it all, then pardon me for looking at this whole situation skeptically. Did George know that these images made you uncomfortable? Did you tell them they did? Because even in accordance to your own document, that doesn't seem to be the case. You tell us that you said it was okay before going on your own self-deprecating tirade about the fact that you'll throw yourself to the dogs for your friends. And I'd even be able to give the benefit of doubt in saying that you could have felt uncomfortable about it all in hindsight, but then not only would that be a lie because you actively told us that your mind wandered to the aforementioned conversation with Gwen, but also, that's in hindsight. This wouldn't change the reaction we see in the screenshots that Leo gave us that would have given George the idea that this was not only okay, but encouraged. Oh, but Doodle, are you trying to say that it's Leo's fault he was groomed? No, I'm saying this isn't grooming at all. A very common tactic of grooming is testing the boundaries to figure out how you can push past them to get into a sexual context. For another example, and I apologize in advance for using an actual instance of grooming as an example. I'm aware of how tasteless this could come off, but I feel it's important to show what it would look like had George actually been trying to groom Leo in a situation such as this, since our community actually has an example. So, let's talk about V Omega. V Omega was outed not even a full year after George's allegations by Joni Rue in a twitlonger. This post outlined that V was an abusive, controlling, transphobic groomer, and I will happily concur to those labels. I'll be talking my experience with them in another video if it's not already out, because I'll have to then. I'll leave a link below to the full twitlonger if you wish to read up on it all, but the particular centerpiece that I want to look at, of course, is the grooming allegations. Though, while Joni didn't exactly have any screenshots relating to that particular allegation and was much more focused on V's abusive behavior, V sure as hell was willing to give them in a now deleted Twitter thread he was making responding to it all. Luckily, I have the important receipts. So, here's a screenshot that V took of their DMs from January of 2018. You can see here that V and Joni are talking about pornography, with Joni explicitly saying that she was not one to look at pornography. By April of the same year, the topic was brought up again, with Joni admitting to sometimes looking at specifically furry porn. By March of the next year, while we don't see the fullest extent of this screenshot, we can see that Joni was all for talking about pornography, showing that V's attempt to wear down her boundaries was, unfortunately, grossly successful. The fucking creep. But we don't see that with George. We're only told that through the lens of Leo, and even through that lens we can see that Leo never vocalized these feelings. So, how do we know that George's motivations are more malicious than maybe tone deaf? We literally can't, and I'm tired of acting like this was okay. Plus, I want to point out that these drawings that Leo alluded to being a source of George's grooming. Even if they were sexual, it wasn't exclusive to Leo, which also puts into question how much of this could actually be considered as such. I've mentioned this in my Sherman videos before, but grooming is a targeted action. Sure, you could argue someone can groom more than one person, but when George is making these kinds of images for anyone who's his friend above just a selection of people, then I'm sorry, even if these had sexual undertones, it would just be grossly irresponsible and inappropriate at worst. Now, let's look at the spin-off to this allegation. George bought his own Snow White dress to wear, posted pictures on his NSFW-ish Twitter, and allegedly gave Leo some pictures of his own whilst pestering Leo to wear one themselves. I really don't know what more to say. This is just more of the same, unfortunately. Leo goes around painting Snow White as one of George's kinks, which has been put into question. Leo makes a very extreme statement claiming that George was sending him pictures of himself wearing that outfit directly, making the claim. The number of photos I got from him wearing the dress was almost 10 times the amount that he posted on his timeline. It very much became a weekly thing for him to do. He would send me 5 or more pictures of him in the dress and ask me for compliments, my overall thoughts, and if he looked cute/pretty. This is then followed by 0 screenshots of George doing this, and being probably the most frustrating example at the lack of screenshots being an issue with this document. Like, I can concede to the idea that maybe Leo wasn't able to get everything. Fine. Like, I'm not even saying that if Leo doesn't have every receipt in the world that these allegations should be put under extreme scrutiny. And I can accept the lack of evidence to a degree. But Leo is making such an enormous claim here alluding to George explicitly targeting them, and if there were that many instances of George doing this, why don't we even see one of them? You were able to get a screen cap between you and George talking about a dress, again with the problem of you visually not setting any boundaries for George to push, but I think I've hammered that in enough. But with the evidence showing George sending direct pics of him wearing the Snow White dress, it doesn't exist. Why? This is one of your biggest allegations and easily one of your most damning ones to boot. Ugh. Anyway, following this, we then get the dysphoria conversation, Leo being an NB trans mask, and this one's a bit more of a gray area. I'm not going to put into question whether dresses do or don't give Leo dysphoria. That is not my place to say. I'm also not entirely too sure whether George did or didn't know whether Leo gets this way about dresses in particular. If George did know, then fuck, that's tone deaf as hell, and this could also go on the record as another one of George's actual transgressions. Get it? If he didn't, then I can't really get onto his case about it, especially since Leo doesn't show his discomfort in the screenshots, and either way, this would be he said she said effectively. Still not grooming, mind you, but also not particularly great had George been guilty of knowingly setting off Leo's dysphoria. The continual excuse of, but George would beat himself up, also doesn't exactly help matters either, because I get it, but those boundaries not being set doesn't give me any reason to believe George's intentions with these conversations are more malicious than two friends bonding over a common interest. I don't want to seem dismissive about these claims, because I can't know how Leo actually felt about these conversations. For all I know, he could have been uncomfortable, and also I get how important it is to believe a victim of abuse. Plus, yeah, not every victim of abuse will know they're being abused. But it's hard to see George as an abuser when zero boundaries were initially drawn, and instead Leo willingly partook in these conversations, leaning into what we are to believe to be George's desires. Leo's words paint one picture, whereas what we can see in the screenshots paints a totally contradictory one, and we're just supposed to believe these images are one of the same. We're not done, by the way. We still have the claim of magic tricks to talk about, and out the gate, I'm screaming. One of the first things you'll notice when going on his NSFW is his pinned tweet that you are encouraged to read before interacting with his page. It was there that he detailed the things that he found sexually appealing, aka his kinks and a few rules of the account. I'm sorry? So, Leo is willing to detail what was in that pinned tweet. He even goes on to explicitly mention the Delcoda chair trick, George's favorite magic trick as outlined by his rules bulletin, but will conveniently leave out the section of Snow White when talking about that. I want to make it clear that I'm not out here trying to pin Leo as this bad person, but covering this document makes it really hard when stuff like this is scattered throughout the entire thing. It gets very blatant. But yeah, so George did have a thing for magic tricks, specifically the Delcoda chair, and yes, he even described it as a kink. So we are getting into some arguably creepy territory, and hey, credit where it's due. Leo talks about how George sent some videos involving something he finds to be his kink, and then actually shows us George doing so. However, and this is where I must remind you all that I'm not an expert and am merely giving my 2 cents on the matter, grooming is usually done with the goal of sexual or financial satisfaction, and regardless of how creepy it may seem within the DMs, and you can definitely make an argument for it or against it being creepy, at the end of the day, I'm not going to fight a person one way or another about it. However, with the screenshots that we see in Leo's document, as much as they exist and show us that George did send these videos, the screenshots seem more conversational than sexual or malicious. The first one shows George sharing the Delcoda chair trick performed by David Copperfield, before presumably going on to talk about the Snow White dress he bought for himself. By the way, cross-dressing in the way George was doing so is also not proof of George doing it to be sexual, just should get that out of the way. If he finds the dress to be more aesthetically appealing, then it's just George not having an issue with cross-dressing. If you want to make an argument otherwise, you're going to have to provide me with some proof that he does find Snow White dresses to be sexual, because I just don't have any reason to believe otherwise besides a because Leo and Gwen said so. The second screenshot was just George talking about how he did draw Leo's character doing the trick, but never actually showed it to Leo, nor did Leo really call George out on being uncomfortable about it, prefaced by Leo continuing the narrative of just because George feels guilty about things means you can't draw boundaries, apparently, as evidenced by the following statements. I did watch them all, but only because I felt pressured to. Maybe it would have been easy for you to say no, but I can't do that. I can't shut someone down like that, especially not someone like George, who practically lives by the philosophy of don't call me out of my bullshit, because I will beat myself up until you feel like a monster and drop the charges. He had done this multiple times. Looking back on it now, I can only really describe it as him forcing his kink on me. We'll talk about his motivations another time, but that is what he is doing. Which only really reaffirms that this was a document that had more of a narrative woven into it, more than just informing people of what happened. By now at this point, you might be wondering what my point is bringing all this stuff up, as it looks like I'm trying to make Leo out to be this worse individual than he is, and that would be a fair assumption to make, especially with just how frustrated I've been getting at this document. However, to clear the air, I'm not saying Leo is doing any of this stuff on purpose. This feels more impulsive than vindictive. Reading the document as much as I have, You can tell he felt very emotional writing it. If this is truly how he felt on the matter, then fine. I'm not going to invalidate someone's feelings on the matter because I can't feasibly know how he actually felt. My point, ultimately, at the end of the day, is that I don't feel as if George is a groomer. There's just not enough evidence to label him as such. Grooming is a targeted, manipulative action used to get something out of a minor, but nothing we see in the screenshots Leo shows demonstrate any form of attempted sexual or financial satisfaction on George's end. I must be fair and reiterate that yes, Leo could have been very uncomfortable by everything the two of them talked about. George could have been very inappropriate, and yes, he was absolutely irresponsible. I'm not saying he did nothing wrong. I just don't see a groomer here. And I feel as if there were people who kinda saw it too quickly. When finally confronted, George ended the final conversation with Leo, admitting to his mistakes and fessing up to the fact that he didn't know these conversations with Leo made Leo uncomfortable. He asked what he could do to make things better besides not grooming, showing that the accusation was something he even believed. And personally, this is my least favorite part of Leo's document. George was apologizing for everything that Leo had taken issue with. Sure, George's apology was self-destructive. As I said, he did have a habit of doing that. However, George also, at the end of the day, understood that the two of them needed time apart. Why was this looked at as a groomer trying to get with a child? Like, George couldn't have known that these conversations were uncomfortable or were seen as inappropriate until Leo told him, because, as stated before, there were no boundaries drawn between the two of them. Once there finally were, George apologized and then the two of them unfollowed each other's vents, breaking off the friendship with each other. This is just not the behavior of a manipulative person. Leo's confusion in this document too is honest to God justified because George saying that he didn't know what he was doing was wrong and apologizing for grooming are two totally contradictory ideas. Because grooming is intentional. Like, yes, you could say George is admitting to grooming here and is apologizing for such, but like, I don't believe that George would have seen it as such had Leo not initially brought it up in their conversation. Neither of them were even sure that this was the case. It was just something that someone else said was grooming. Ugh. At the end of the day, to recap, do I think George groomed Leo? No. Do I think George was irresponsible? Absolutely. Do I think this document does its job properly? No. Do I think Leo should have drawn boundaries with George sooner? Yes. Do I think Leo is a bad person? No. Do I believe Leo was a victim? Well, personally speaking, yes. That last one might be a bit of a confusing statement to make, what with everything I outlined today, but if you'll allow me, I have been thinking about this document a lot, and as I said earlier, I don't believe Leo wrote this document with the goal to purposely ruin George's friendships or reputation in the community. The language used within this document seems more concerned and scared than anything else, almost as if somebody else implanted the belief that this behavior was grooming. And we know that there is, considering Gwen's reaction to George drawing people in Snow White dresses, was to directly tell Leo not to allow George to do that, plus the conversation George and Leo had breaking it off. Now, perhaps I'm thinking too deep into it, perhaps this is a bit conspiratorial. At the end of the day, this is speculation, so take this section with more of a grain of salt. However, I just can't get over that last portion. Leo's last DM with George, where he starts the conversation telling George that some other people brought up that George was grooming him. I'm not gonna say who because that's not important. I don't believe that. So throughout Leo's document, Charlie or Channel Grey and Gwen are constantly alluded to as people that Leo was super close to. Coming from someone who was also friends with the both of them for a brief period of time though, they both had a history of not liking George. So back in mid-2018, I think, George actually initially wrote a document about Channel Grey being abusive towards him, with Gwen following in this abuse. In this document, George outlined how Grey would get overly aggressive at the most menial of transgressions, how they had a mentality that you had to immediately change or fuck off and get thrown out of the group or thrown out of chats, how Charlie in particular was kind of a two-faced individual who'd be quick to turn on those they had a problem with, how Charlie had a complete disregard to mental disorders, how they had a tendency to start shit with other people, how confrontational they were about everything, even if it didn't really need to be a big of a deal, would actually guilt-trip those who cut them off. I can vouch for that one. Jesus, it really is like talking about V Omega all over again. But yes, Channel Grey was incredibly a toxic person who I would not put past to be the person implanting seeds into Leo's head about George grooming them. And with Ren effectively being described in that document as Charlie's yes girl at the time, her backing Gray up on all this also doesn't exactly surprise me. That doesn't even touch on what they did to some of their other friends. Mind you, again, this part of my video is speculation to be honest, and I could be totally off base with this claim. All I know is that when you get a person who is willing to be this abusive and manipulative, and give them the idea that they could do something like this is an outcome that could be possible. But ultimately, I won't say for sure one way or another. I don't actually have evidence to back this up. On that note, I also won't say one way or another that George for sure wasn't guilty or wasn't innocent. I don't believe he's a groomer, personally. I don't think there was nearly enough evidence to say that he is, and I hope I was able to make my case clear enough for you guys to understand. Maybe I've changed some minds, maybe I've at least put another perspective on the situation. Maybe I'm totally off base with defending a groomer. I'm sure some of you will happily tell me I am regardless, but in any case, I just wanted to get this off my chest. I do hope everyone involved is having a good day, is making a change in their life, and I hope you guys continue having a good day after this video is out there. This is Doodle Tones, and time to see what happens. Take care, everyone.